Thank you very much, Jeff. Thank you for that introduction. Well, welcome everybody to the final keynote of this Beyond COP26 conference. Let's just remind ourselves for a minute what COP26 is going to be about. It's going to be 25,000 people. It's going to be in Glasgow. It's coming to us all in November. And it really has one major goal, and that is to get everybody to agree to the commitments to go to net zero by 2050. And of course, that really means the world's top 10 economies, the economies of China, the United States, India, the European Union, the United Kingdom, Japan, Australia, Canada, because these will be still the biggest contributors even by then to emissions around the world. It is going to be really difficult. I really laud the UN for managing to pull this COP together with the British government and bring it to Glasgow. And I absolutely believe they will achieve some significant agreements. And those agreements do matter. So nothing that I'm going to say in this talk is belittling the achievement that COP will be if they pull off a sort of net zero commitment by 2050. But the fact of the matter is that the existing commitment of 1.5 degrees Celsius, we know is going to be busted by 2050. We know we're probably heading for 2 degrees. And we also know that the commitments made in all the COPs going back, as important as they've been, and as important that we don't belittle them in any way, it's been very difficult to achieve them. And many people have said, oh, the reason for that is X, Y, or Z. Quite often, the reason is given as China, responsible for nearly 30% of the emissions of the world, has increased its emissions since 1990, whilst those of countries like the United Kingdom and the United States have gone down. China has increased its emissions by 4 times during that period, as it's become the industrial powerhouse for the rest of the world, and as they've been exporting those emissions by producing goods for all of us. But even this last 6 months, China has approved the commissioning of another 24 new coal-fired power stations. So its emissions are not going to start to reduce until 2030 or 40 at the earliest. And that, according to people like Adair Turner, for example, in the UK, is just going to be too late. So I am basing this talk not on the fact that COP's not going to be a great achievement, but on the fact that beyond COP26, we are going to have to really think out of the box technologically, because there's another elephant in the room that I think is much more significant than the issue of China and emissions, or the issue of the European Union or United States and emissions. The important issue is population. In the turn of the millennium, it was about the year 2000, I met Al Gore at Sir Richard Branson's house in London to discuss his new film that was coming out. And in that, my biggest concern was his graph on population, which kind of showed it topping out at about 9 billion around the time that we're in now. And I said, I don't believe that's going to happen. And indeed, it isn't happening. And the population growth that we're seeing at the moment is in a trend line that will take us to 8 billion in the next literally year or two. We added 100 million in the last year, even during COVID. Despite the best efforts of a horrible virus, our population grew by 100 million globally. And it will head to 11 billion by the 2050s. And that is not sustainable. We cannot sustain life on this planet if we continue to think that we can reduce emissions at a rate which will allow us to still cope with that population growth. And as it reaches 12 to 13 billion by the end of the century, the crisis will even continue to deepen. Because we simply have to feed that number of people. And doing it in a zero carbon environment is almost impossible. For the simple reason that most of our fertilizer comes from oil or from gas. We have to get agriculture to work. We can electrify large parts of the planet. We can move many things around, but emissions don't stop. And the number of people is a function of the amount of emissions by the use of technology itself. For example, one of the biggest sources of carbon in the atmosphere these days is data centers, or server farms as they're called, and our own communications. When I go and watch Squid Game on Netflix, currently the most popular series on Netflix, which is being shown around the world, trillions and trillions of electrons are moving around the world from data centers everywhere. If I'm silly enough to be mining Bitcoin, then every year I'm producing the entire CO2 output of Denmark just to do that one activity on the internet. So data centers alone are a source of emissions, and they are a function of population growth as much as anything else, as well as the growth of the use of data as technology gets into more and more hands. So if we want to really sort things out after COP26, we have to do all the things that you've heard about, all the things you'll have heard about from people like Ian Marchant during this conference. We'll have to electrify our cars, our tractors. We'll have to make much more use of hydrogen. We'll have to electrify our aeroplanes and make much use of synthetic fuels produced by the excess wind power, for example, a country like Britain might be producing by 2040 as we reduce our emissions but rely on renewable energy. And at times we're going to have to store it, but we might be producing fuels to do that. And that might be what makes things like the RAF work in the future, the Royal Air Force. They might run on synthetic fuels produced by times when there's excess wind, and they can use the Fischer-Tropsch process or other processes to produce fuel. All of these things need to happen. And all of the things that the company I'm chair of called Good Energy PLC, we have wind farms and solar farms. And we need to get going with producing more renewable energy for the consumers at home in the UK. But the fact is that by themselves, we cannot get to net zero in time for the emergency to become anything but a bigger emergency. So we have to begin to think technologically out of the box. And that means that we mustn't be Luddite about our approach to climate change. Stopping doing industrial activities would have to stop doing the digital activities we do. We would have to stop doing things that feed us. Because of that population growth, we need to think out that box. And to my mind, the real answer is going to be space. It has become quite clear over the last 15 years, as the space industry has rapidly begun to develop, that we have solutions. Now that's interesting, because many consumers and many people out there see space as yet another problem. Why, I am sometimes asked, why are we going into space and doing anything in space when we've got all these problems on planet Earth? So let's start with that premise. Why are we doing things in space when we've got all these problems on planet Earth? Well, the simple answer is this. We are doing most of the things we're doing in space to help alleviate the existing problems on planet Earth. For instance, the GPS systems or similar that we're developing, Galileo in Europe, GPS system in the United States, and other systems that might be developed by countries like the UK independently in Japan. These tracking systems alone are allowing us to feed ourselves in a way that we couldn't do 30 years ago. It used to be that 10% of all the food produced in the world largely spoiled in containers in ports or couldn't leave a farm because the farmer didn't know, because there weren't satellites telling him that there was about to be a massive storm and he couldn't lift his crop in time and get it into storage. He then couldn't move it somewhere. Containers would be held up for long enough by bad weather, etc., etc. Well, the GPS systems of the world have largely solved that problem. So we're producing 10% more food than we would be without space. And those agriculture and weather satellites are giving us the ability to produce food on a scale that we wouldn't be able to do otherwise. In addition to that, it is only the satellites that we put up since the 1970s that have told us about the CFC problem and the ozone hole. They gave us the first initial warnings. They also tell us how we're doing on CFCs. The satellites are tracking its illegal production still in some countries in Asia. And the fact that CFCs are still being produced, we can now, with the new satellites we've got, actually pinpoint where the factories are and get onto the Chinese or the Vietnamese government and tell them. We can also now, with space, monitor climate change in a way that was never possible in the early days. The current generation of smaller satellites are giving us literally a minute-by-minute appraisal of different situations. They're also telling us about things going on in the Antarctic, the Arctic, under the oceans, above the oceans, in every layer of the atmosphere. It is only with this knowledge that we have any chance of surviving as a species. So space is already part of the solution and not part of the problem. However, how can it help really solve the problem in a way that all the good things we'll do within the Earth's atmosphere will make a stab at, but because of that population elephant, they won't be able to achieve by themselves? Well, the simple answer is this. We now have the technology in space to become industrialized in space on a scale that has never been seen before. We also have the technology to put that dirty data, that digitization, which is now producing more CO2 in the atmosphere than was previously being produced by things like the transport industry. We have the chance to put those server farms, those data centers in space. We're already on the cusp of it with OneWeb and Starlink. They will be doing broadband from space by the end of the year and beginning of next year. In addition to that, it will be possible to put the server farms and power them from space. And that would take all that heat out of the atmosphere. Data centers not only use often coal-fired power stations in the Far East, oil-fired power stations in California, and the same in places like Holland. They not only use that source of energy, but they also themselves produce a lot of heat on site, some of which can be captured for home heating, but not a lot. So if we can put those in space and power them off that biggest of all nuclear reactors, the sun, using solar power 24/7 at 80% efficiency, we will transform the digital economy into one that is carbon neutral truly. Now let's take that the next stage. If we are producing solar power on that kind of scale in space, we can also produce solar power in space 24 hours a day at over 80% efficiency from that great nuclear reactor called the sun. And we can beam that down to the planet using microwave radiation. This is no longer science fiction. This is available technology. And what's held back developing it already has been lack of investment, both in the private sector and by government. And at the same time, there hasn't necessarily been the willpower because we believe we can do everything inside the atmosphere. But the atmosphere is a sealed petri dish. That's why the population growth at the level it's at now, given the amount of CO2 we're already producing, is such a problem. It was Professor James Lovelock in the 1970s with his Gaia theory who first told us about the fact that Gaia, a new theory of life on Earth, as they called it then, was a petri dish in which this sealed unit would eventually overheat. He was the first person to truly understand and give us that holistic, polymathic picture of what was happening to the planet. And nothing he said has been disproven since. Therefore, industrialization in space is even more important than we could have possibly have imagined even a few years ago when many of us were beginning to think of how to do it. Now, why is it possible now to think about this science fiction world of industrialization in space as science fact, technological possibility, and economic imperative? Well, the reason is it's down to space launch systems. Every industrial revolution in history has been denominated by a cheaper method of distribution. The sailing ship arrived, the canal arrived, the railway arrived, etc., etc. Steam-powered ships, ways of moving around the planet, containerization, and then digitization. Distribution systems are really important, and now we've had a breakthrough in that. I'll give you an example. Elon Musk's Spacex launch system, which is capable of launching really heavy kit into space, the International Space Station, it'll be capable of taking a moon base to the moon, is not only pretty environmentally efficient because it's all reusable, but also it's cheap to operate compared with the old systems, compared with the likes of the Saturn V or the Ariane space or the space shuttle. This is a really cheap, reliable system. Now you combine that with the nimbleness of a company like Virgin Orbit, where it's 747. Again, 747 gets rid of the dirty first stage of the rocket and can launch lots of small satellites into space from anywhere you want in the world very easily and cheaply. These types of systems are going to revolutionize our ability to build technology in space. Combine that with the new AI developments that we've seen, and I can clearly see within 5 years we can be robotically building technology up there which can take industrial processes out of the Earth's atmosphere and put them in that place where we've got the limitless power of that massive fusion reactor called the sun, and we can truly use it in a way which solar power can only do for a few hours a day at some less efficiency because of the atmosphere down here. We can truly supplement the wind power we're going to be producing. Imagine a wind farm in 10, 15 years' time out on the Dogger Bank in the North Sea, and the wind turbines are turning. But in the middle of that, where the power is being shipped abroad, you've got a microwave receiving center offshore, away from where it can do any harm to people, and it's 24/7 receiving microwave power down from a massive solar array up there, which is able to work around the clock, 365 days a year. That is the vision of solar from space and the vision of a digitized economy from space, no longer damaging the atmosphere within the planet. These are only some of the processes that we can take out of the atmosphere. There are many others we're able to do. There are lots of fantastic companies working on them as well. I can see us very, very shortly being able to do the kind of things in space that have been very difficult, especially things like pharmaceutical manufacturing. Things can actually take advantage of the fact that space is dirty, i.e., very radioactive. It's a vacuum, and it's near absolute zero. There are so many processes in the planet that produce huge amounts of basically carbon effect because they need to get to these conditions to produce the things that we rely on. I can see pharmaceutical experimentation and manufacture moving to space. I can see many, many other similar processes. And the exciting thing, I think, is that it's actually here now. There are companies being invested in at the moment that are beginning to put together the quantum computing in space that's going to be needed to manage those kind of processes. One just floated, that was a British company that floated on the US stock market in the last few weeks, called Arcit. There's a fantastic little company, it's a startup in Cardiff called Spaceforge, which is looking at taking these industrial processes outside the atmosphere and designing the techniques to do so as we speak. As I said, the Spacex system and the Starlinks and the OneWebs are already moving to operational readiness to bring our broadband from space. So this is not a brave new world. It's a happening world, and it's happening now. Now, to my mind, I think that we now need to look beyond COP26 to a COP27. COP26, as I said before, if we can get these kind of net zero commitments, even if they can't necessarily be achieved, that will be great. And we need to be working on much more wind, much more solar. We need to be working on fusion power. We need to be working on making our processes much more efficient so as they use less energy. The next iteration of LED lights, the next this, the next that. We need to now use technology and not fear it, because it's the only thing that's going to allow us to feed that burgeoning population. But as we look beyond that COP26 to a COP27, we need to think about much more investment in doing the things in the place where we're not going to damage this petri dish, and that's outside the atmosphere. All in all, the world has seen many, many, many things that have frightened us. There's been a history of doom in the world. If you go back to, and in fact, it's a very interesting thing to study. If you go back to the time of the Black Death and the vision that people had of what was happening to the world then, they didn't believe there was a future. I grew up in a world in the 1960s where many of us weren't sure there was a future. We were shown programs in our classrooms about how to survive a nuclear attack, which the answer was, you quickly realized, even at the age of 8, was that you probably weren't going to survive a nuclear attack. So we grew up in an atmosphere of fear, but we didn't let it make us fearful as a generation. We just got on with it. And we mustn't approach the COPs, the 26 or the 27 that will follow, in an atmosphere of fear. We must approach it in an atmosphere of inquiring, an atmosphere of doing. I loved the video that was shown of the students, because it is time to do things. It's really important to do things. And academics are great at helping us to think about how to do them, but we need to mobilize industry to do them. I'm greatly looking forward to the next few years as Chancellor of Edinburgh Napier University, and I'm greatly looking forward to working with students here on ideas for how the courses in a university like this can be working towards that world I envisage, where we have decarbonised in the atmosphere and we've used the area outside it to help that process on, and we are able to sustain that population and hopefully bring about a lessening of its growth as we all get richer and wealthier and more able to live in smaller families in the future. That's the future we need to try and look forward to. It's going to be really hard to achieve. But the fact is, just because things are really hard, it doesn't mean we shouldn't do them. My closing remark is from John F. Kennedy. He said when he was talking about going to the moon in 1960, and he was going to basically commit the US government to getting to the moon by the end of the decade. And he remembered that Mallory, who had climbed Everest in the 1920s but not quite got to the top, who'd been a friend of his father's, had said, he said, why did you climb? Why did you want to climb Everest? Because it was there. And he said when he talked about getting to the moon by 1970, he said, we choose to do these things not because they are easy, but because they are hard. And that's what this future is going to be for all of us. And we should choose to embrace it and choose to work on it and not get what I keep hearing about is a syndrome these days called climate doom. What we should be thinking about is achieving a climate neutrality with our world around us that will allow our environment, our ecosystem to thrive, because we're the only ones who are not going to be around. The planet will survive us if we don't do these things. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think we have absolutely had 20 minutes of willpower right there. So thank you for that. I thought you were starting off, I thought we were going to go down quite a controversial route, if I'm really honest. But actually, I think what you're saying is really there is no silver bullet. There is no one thing that we can do that will. It's a complementary suite of actions and activities that we have to put in place and we have to introduce. And space is just one of those. I don't think you're suggesting that space is a silver bullet answer that's going to solve everything.
Well, quite the opposite. It's a thing that we need in the armory. And to get it in the armory, we're going to require much more investment. One of the things I haven't touched on yet, because I was thinking you might raise it, is that the kind of investment needed in space will be in the hundreds of billions to get these technologies to work. But on the ground, it's going to have to be in the hundreds of billions to move to anywhere like net zero. So we really have to mobilize on all fronts, and we have to stop treating palliatives as a way forward. I mean, I at home, we do a little bit of sort of horticultural market gardening, farming at home. We feed ourselves largely, and we're pretty organic. I'm realistic enough to know that that's not possible if we're going to a population of the size we are. I'm realistic enough to know that we're going to have to stop. We're going to have to keep on producing gas from places like the North Sea in order to make fertilizer to feed ourselves. And oil, even if we manage to get rid of it for almost every other purpose, we're still going to have to get, millions of barrels of oil out of the ground every year for a long time to come. We have to be realistic about that. We have to also be realistic about the fact that much as, my daughter's a vegan. I love veganism. The fact is, it has to be part of a mix of things. That's not going to solve the problem because there's just too many of us and the population is growing too fast. So it's an armory. It's a very good way to put it, because this is going to be a battle because of that population growth. So we need to think about how we start stocking the armory and pulling out the weapons to begin to do the different things we have to do. And the thing is, we are perfectly capable of this. We have met very, very large challenges in the past, and human beings have actually been very good at them and have learned from them. Be it pandemics in the past, be it wars in the past, be it huge things. I mean, Ian Marchant was talking earlier about the fact that the major cities of the world, had a massive crisis with manure in the 1890s. Because again, population was growing, industrialization was happening, with all sorts of new technologies coming along. People were living in cities more because of telephone, electricity. But of course, they hadn't found a solution to horses. So the horse population, by 1900, horses were eating 20% of the food that human beings produced. And 20% of human beings on the planet were having to look after horses. And therefore, by 1905 to 1910, both Edison's electric cars and the internal combustion engines of Chrysler and Daimler-Benz and others and Rolls-Royce were seen as saviors environmentally. And that is the world we live in. We live in a world where a problem that's solved one place won't be solved in another. And the only way to really think about these things is holistically. If we thought holistically in 1910, we'd have nurtured Thomas Edison's electric cars and made sure there was much more investment in those. My grandfather was a great believer in that. He developed the world's first petrol electric car in 1927. And the first patent for what's now called the Hyperloop, a train system, was electromagnetic, called the Sphericar in 1932. He believed in a future that was electric because he saw pollution even then as a problem. And of course, it was by then, the 1930s, that climate change was first being identified. Long before we were able to see it from space, people were identifying it theoretically at that time. So we need to think about this problem holistically, and we need to be polymathic in our response to it.
So when we started this, I kind of had this image of you as kind of like Buzz Lightyear, because it was all going to be up in space. And now you've put this image in my head of you in your welly boots down on the farm. If only we'd come up with this idea. It could have been Will's Farm on Amazon that people were watching every week. But that's for another day. You're talking about the huge investment, and we are talking, I mean, mind-bogglingly huge investments in a lot of this stuff. And it actually leans into one of the first questions that we have for you, which is, so how can we prioritize carbon mitigation via space technology rather than tourism or militarization? And should state-operated space administrations like NASA be reclaiming their primary role?
I actually think the opposite. I actually believe that the systems, like, it's interesting. When the railways first developed, Stockton to Darlington in 1826, they were originally to carry coal. But in fact, the only reason the railways took off was because they started carrying people, and that was more profitable. And the coal went back on the canal for a while, and then eventually the railways grew out and started carrying freight around the world. Actually, a little bit of space tourism has helped develop the system, which is now launching the satellites. And that's what you have to think of it as. They're almost irrelevant. I don't care if a few billionaires, are developing something that gives a little bit of tourism, because it's so environmentally irrelevant, it's untrue. What I want to see is the system that can get the technology into space to solve problems. And if you carry, as a result of the investment, a few people who are prepared to pay some money, which is going towards developing these systems, I don't have a problem with that. That's always been true of industrializing. And as for NASA, by concentrating on the space science and allowing and funding Elon Musk to develop SpaceX, has ended up with a much cheaper space launch system. The shuttle was $1 billion a launch. It had cost $30 billion to develop, and it had 300,000 moving parts, and it crashed twice. You had a 1 in 100 chance of death in it. It wasn't one of NASA's crowning glories in an otherwise excellent organization. And what Elon has done with SpaceX and what is happening with Virgin Orbit and its space launch system, and even with Virgin Galactic and the technologies it's developing. I mean, somebody talks about tourists because they're not thinking this through. That system is, with the next iteration of motor, going to be able to take people around the planet without using the atmosphere, and therefore getting rid of long-haul flying. That's the way we've got to think of these things, and we've got to stop being small-minded about them.
So I remember you mentioning to me another time that Elon is about a quarter of the cost of any kind of state-run operation. I mean, how does that happen? How does Elon come up with a business model that is 75% cheaper than the existing technology?
I have absolutely watched in amazement, I have to say. I remember in 2004, there was an act passed through the American Congress called the Commercial Space Launch Amendment Act, which is what's led to all this burgeoning space activity. And it freed up, it gave a regulatory environment that you could develop private space launch companies, such as Virgin and SpaceX and Blue Origin and many other businesses that are now developing. And, I was skeptical about the approach he was taking, because it was so incredible what he was working on doing. By building rockets, you can actually re-land again each section and stage and save so much environmental impact by doing that. But they've achieved it. And they've achieved it because he was in the right place at the right time in the right circumstances, just like Henry Ford was in his day. He was at the right place with Silicon Valley. He developed PayPal as a business. So he was in with the Silicon Valley crowd. He was kind of in with the Hollywood crowd. And as a result of that, he managed to raise the money to develop the most incredible space launch system we have seen. Something the US government wasn't funding. It was just funding the same rocketry again that had been groundbreaking 70 years ago. So this was truly breakthrough. But he was helped by the US government and by NASA because NASA became a procurement company to encourage these new developments that would say, put down a marker and say, we'll take so many launches from you. We'll put a bit of seed corn money up that you can raise money against. This is something I'm trying to encourage the British government to do here. We really need to get behind this kind of concept of using the state alongside the private sector, but with the idea of achieving goals. Now, something I will tell you about is the new National Space Launch Strategy. The National Space Launch Strategy was actually in the midst of this gas crisis we're all in at the moment, was announced last week. So you haven't exactly seen it on the front of the BBC News. But the National Space Strategy is a really important document because it shows that the government means what it says. It's about putting joined up thinking together of a national strategy to develop the space industry here, with one of the number one priorities being for climate change mitigation, because they have officially now realised in BEIS and the MOD and the Treasury and all those other big government departments that space has a huge role to play, not only in things like Earth observation and observing climate change, but actually in mitigating it through industrialization. That is in the document. And that is basically the starter for 10 to get government money going into projects. And there are some really fascinating projects around that are being done by British companies and companies overseas, which can achieve the things that I was talking about technologically earlier.
I want to take you back to that part of the talk that you were giving, where we're talking about pushing a lot of those data servers and a lot of that infrastructure up into space. I spent 20 years at Mercedes-Benz and was there in large part over the conversations we were having at the time around going down an F-cell route of hydrogen or an electric vehicle route. And to be honest, at the time, most of that thinking was like, let's see if we can make F-cells work. EVs were always seen as a little bit of a gamble because people had range anxiety. And anxiety is an interesting thing because we have tech anxiety now. One of the questions that came in is the world went into panic this week when Facebook and its associated sites of Instagram and the rest and WhatsApp were down for 6 hours. If more and more of our tech is in space and there's an even bigger risk of failure and disruption, and we're increasingly relying on it, how do you alleviate that kind of tech stress of people going, oh no, I don't want it up in space in case it goes wrong?
From my experience of space, there's a far lower risk of disruption because space is stable. The only thing that can hurt a satellite or something doing this kind of work in space is a plasma outburst or a Carrington event, which will have a far bigger impact on the planet Earth. And we now harden satellites against plasma events from the sun. That's about the only space weather that you get. Otherwise, it's a far more stable environment than down here. And I actually believe that it would help solve some of the problems that one's seeing at the moment with outages of that type, which come about for a mixed variety of reasons. I mean, we had one of the problems in the early days of the gas price rises and such like in the last couple of weeks, and the energy price rise in Britain, was that our interconnector failed because it was taking power from France to the UK. I can tell you now, microwaving power from space, once you've stabilized and learned how to do it, is an awful lot easier than lots of cables being connected under the North Sea or the Channel, which can get snagged by trawlers, as happens a lot with. I mean, one of the transatlantic cables actually got cut by trawling nets that was taking the internet between the United States and the UK. And the UK is a big hub for those. So I actually see space as a risk mitigator, not a greater risk in that regard. But yes, tech fear is a big thing. And personally, range anxiety, I had my first experience of it last weekend in my electric car going to London and back for dinner. We only made it by 5 miles because I'd forgot to take the charging cable. But I discovered when I arrived at our friend's house in Chiswick that now all the lampposts have got charging cables on them. So you can charge and you do it online and you can charge your cars. There are charging cables mushrooming up everywhere in London. And then I am in here in Edinburgh in my first inaugural speech as Chancellor, being very disappointedly walking around Edinburgh and not seeing many charging cables. So get your act together, Edinburgh, on the charging cable front. And on range anxiety, it's real because I've just had it. On tech anxiety, I actually felt it today because I didn't bring my iPad to Edinburgh Napier. And I suddenly worried that maybe I needed to bring it to do this talk, but they were very well equipped with the tech here. Um, I absolutely think we have to get into that Roosevelt mode over these issues that we face. That was really the whole background to what I was saying. There is nothing to fear here now but fear itself, because we know these things are happening. We know the population is going to get to at least 11 billion. We know carbon neutrality by 2050 is going to be incredibly difficult. But we've got to keep doing those things and then add on the building blocks of the new industrialization outside the atmosphere to allow humanity to continue to thrive and to thrive in the solar system and beyond it. I knew Professor Stephen Hawking not very well, but I knew him, and he was a great believer that humanity, whatever happened environmentally, which he understood very well, whatever happened environmentally, humanity had to leave the planet anyway, because there would be some other catastrophic event coming from space in the form of asteroids, meteorites, in the form of the caldera coming off, the top of Yellowstone National Park, or. And he said, if we look back historically to both events of space that have happened to the planet, we probably got 5,000 years to get out of the planet anyway, even if we fix the environmental problem. And he faced that with an optimism rather than a pessimism. He was a very optimistic person. And I think that, for that reason, out of honour to James Lovelock, who is still alive, who I also know not very well, but do know, and in honour to people like Stephen Hawking, we owe it to them to continue to push forward our knowledge and technology to allow us to thrive and allow this planet to not kill us, because that's the real issue. We don't, in the long term, do much damage to the planet with these horrible things we're doing. We damage the ability of us and other mammals to live on it, because it will always recover from us once we're gone. So we owe it to ourselves to do this. We shouldn't think too arrogantly that in some way we're saving the planet. We're saving humanity, and we're saving all the cohort of animals alongside us, the doggies and the cats, and all the myriad other mammals and fish which will not thrive well. But the new ones will come along because of the imperative of nature if we're not around to see it. So let's think about saving ourselves in this context.
Yeah. And you talk there about that need, and that does require behavioral change. I mean, I think what we've been talking about is a vision where we can carry on with a lifestyle and carry on with the technologies and the access and the ease of living that we currently have while this population grows. But in actual fact, what we are saying is there does need to be significant behavioral change. I mean, Carl Egan has put in a question which actually says, didn't the lockdown show how inaction rather than industry actually helps the biosphere? We have to stop doing
very
much
good point.
stuff.
And I totally agree that we cannot, whatever we do, continue as was before. And that's a very good question. But what we do have to remember is that inactivity has meant that this year we're having problems feeding ourselves because we didn't produce enough and we didn't store enough. We didn't store gas to heat our homes last year because we weren't moving enough around the planet. We didn't store much in the way of food, and now there are massive issues with getting enough food to feed the population of the world this year. So the inactivity worked for a while because we depleted resources in the inactivity sitting at home. We increased our use of data enormously. So we got those coal-fired power stations working even harder in China, which is why they've just authorized another 25 of them. So think not of your inactivity, but think of the activity that allowed you to be inactive during that period. And actually, there was a bit of a misnomer there. But I agree with the principle behind the point. I think we should be flying less. I think we don't need to move as often. But digitization is not necessarily a compensation. We need to think about the way we use the planet for us to survive. And when I say we need to use technology, I don't mean to say it's business as usual plus technology. It's not business as usual. We need to change the way we live. And it's not easy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a difficult thing to do.
Going back to that resource question that we had about the huge resources required to tackle some of this stuff, Julie Fitzpatrick asks, how do we get the richer countries to target investments required for the whole planet when some seem more interested in just their national targets?
Well, I think that's a blooming good question. And it's a very difficult one to answer because human beings have a selfishness when it comes to issues which are urgent and difficult for them, which has been very hard to overcome historically. And it was, after all, the reason the United Nations was formed in 1945 was to overcome that human selfishness and nationalism. And I think one of the reasons that I'm very keen on space activity is because you can provide universal benefit with it. It's relatively cheap now to take advantage of. One of the things that these new broadband systems are going to do is bring very cheap, efficient working broadband to parts of Africa that don't have it and parts of South America that don't have it. Because once those things are up going around the planet, they're truly global. And producing microwave power from space can be done truly globally. But I think the other thing that's important is that we target investment for those who are definitely going to suffer from the effects of human activity in the shorter term. And we've not been very good at that yet. The communities in the Pacific, for example, we need to really target how we're going to help them to cope with the rising sea level. We're also going to have to help in a way which we say we're going to do, but we haven't quite done yet. There was going to be 100 billion agreed at the Paris Accords for use in this area by 2020. Well, actually, the world allocated to the LDCs about 80 billion in that period. So they missed their target by 20, but they did get to 80. My personal feeling is that investing in technological solutions that can be globalized for people is a really good way to do this. Because you can produce wind power in the United Kingdom, and we could become the greatest wind power nation on earth because we've got a lovely big continental shelf and we're one of the windiest countries on the planet. But that doesn't help somebody in Zimbabwe. So we've got to think about that hard. We've got to think about how the new technologies within the planet's atmosphere, which can be managed from space, can help do that. So just as you can beam solar power down, we could produce in Morocco, for example, huge amounts of solar power very, very easily because they've developed enough technological ability to put solar power there. And it is now economically possible. And there is a fundraise going on right now to produce a power cable which would run from the UK to Morocco. And that would help both countries. Just as the developed countries do, we have one between Norway now, where hydro and wind power are going to be swapped. We have one to France, where nuclear and wind power from Britain are going to be swapped, because Britain will become the wind power powerhouse of the world. Now, we should start to be able to do that on a much broader scale. And that's where space technology can come in, as I was saying, because we could have a receiving area in the middle of that solar farm in Morocco for microwave solar. And they can be an economic benefit there because it's an industrial use of a resource which currently has very, very, very little in the way of an environmental benefit because it's already been ravaged by ecological destruction.
So I guess what we're leaning into is there is a shared responsibility and we're going to have to make joint commitments and COP and this one coming up, which is happening in your house, by the way, that's the forum for those kind of discussions. So all eyes are going to be on COP to come up with these kind of concordats and agreements. Are you optimistic about what's going to be happening in Scotland in November?
I'm going to absolutely say I'm optimistic because there is no room anymore for pessimism in this situation. Otherwise, we're all dead. It's as simple as that. Because pessimism leads to inaction. Optimism is the cradle of action, and we need action. And I am not optimistic that the targets that are set at COP and maybe will get agreed. Let's pray they get agreed. So we pray for agreement and we agree that we get to some sort of net zero, at least in the most developed economies by 2050. China's saying already it'll be 2060 for China. Well, that's not good enough. You'll have to do better. But let's say we get those agreements. That's great. That's a tick. Then there's achieving them. That requires the action. but we assume that we won't necessarily achieve them for the reasons I've said, that burgeoning population and the sheer difficulty. So therefore, we also think about what we can now do to augment those. And we can't augment them all by us all sitting at home, because we will eventually starve to death. So we have to find these solutions. We can only have our periods of inaction when we're not active doing the things we need to do to survive. I do agree, going back to that question, that we don't need to be so frenzied as individuals traveling around the planet, but we need to be frenzied in using technology in new ways.
And that seems a perfect juncture to close this inaugural Chancellor's talk. Will, it lived up to everything I think we were expecting it to be, and probably even a bit more in the honest and candid way you have answered some of these questions for us, and posed some of those thought-provoking challenges as well. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I know you've come up to the university today. You're in one of our little broadcast suites on a different floor. So we really appreciate the time and effort. And I know you came up on the train, so that was well done, better than flying. But it was good for you to come up. I think we've all enjoyed this. I will leave it. Miles Weaver commented, outstanding talk, how blessed we are to have such an inspiring Chancellor. And I think I couldn't have put that. I know that's quite a lot of responsibility with that. Well, yeah, I know. I'm not setting any bar here at all, Will. Good luck with that. We've got graduations coming up, so we'll see how well you doff your cap at that. But Will, really appreciate your time. Looking forward to many more Chancellor talks, which we'll be hosting at the university with yourself and a whole range of inspired guests coming up. So our conversations will continue. But for now, Will Whitehorn, Chancellor of Edinburgh Napier University.
Live long and prosper.